Today, we're going to go back to 1869, a period in Nietzsche's life and thought that most interpreters don't usually talk about unless they're going through, the events of his early life as a background for his work. This is when Nietzsche was a college professor, and in fact, the very first year that he served as professor of classical philology at Basel University. Now, it's not as if the philological period of Nietzsche's life remains unexplored. Rather, when we discuss his philological career, it's usually The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872. Usually that's the starting point. And there are certainly other important works from this period that we've also covered on the podcast: Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, the Pre-Platonic Lectures, Nietzsche's Lectures on Rhetoric, the Untimely Meditations, the Unfinished Essay on Truth and Lies and the Non-Moral Sense. But not only do you get more and more obscure into the canon of Nietzsche the further you go from Birth of Tragedy, but all of these works even come at a later time than the work that we're going to consider here today, which is Nietzsche's inaugural address as a professor. This is his first public lecture, delivered at the University of Basel, 28th of May, 1869. The only works we've ever considered on the podcast that predate this one would be Nietzsche's dissertation on Theognis of Megara and his essay from Forta about Plato's Symposium. And those works are also very interesting for charting the development of Nietzsche's thought, understanding how it is he came to some of his later positions, and what held his interest in the ancient world during his days as a student. His inaugural speech is even a bit different from that material, however, because it's the first time Nietzsche is speaking as an authority in his field. As we all know, Nietzsche was made a professor at the unprecedented age of 24 years old, at the recommendation of the prominent philologist Friedrich Ritschl. We can imagine what kind of expectations there were for this young man, for the young Nietzsche, and what expectations he must have placed upon himself. This lecture is the first time that he would be invited to show the world of philology his talents, which had been so touted by his mentors. We have the text of that speech, which is entitled Homer in Classical Philology, and today we're going to take a look at it, and I'm going to attempt something a bit ambitious. I'm going to attempt to show how even here in this lecture, relatively obscure compared to the rest of Nietzsche's canon, completely concerned with philology, not at all with philosophy in any explicit way, we can nevertheless find the foundations of Nietzsche's philosophical work. Not in a fully developed form, mind you, but instead the concerns that underlie this lecture and the guiding questions in Nietzsche's thought will lead him eventually to begin philosophizing. And in my analysis, I will also bring in some cross-referencing with Nietzsche's material on the use and abuse of history for life and his fragmentary, unpublished essay, We Philologists. Now, Nietzsche's inaugural lecture addresses itself to some relatively esoteric concerns, relative to the general public's interests anyway, which is the authorship of Homer. Did one person write the Iliad and the Odyssey, or did many people write these works? And if many people composed these epic poems, was there a single genius and then a series of elaborators, or were there a series of geniuses? Or were there perhaps just a series of unremarkable figures simply passing down the stories in an oral tradition, which was then perhaps stitched together by a general artistic zeitgeist, or maybe organized later by a later genius? And more than this, what is the meaning of this question for how we engage with Homer? What is the meaning for the philologist? Yes, but also for the broader culture. And so we might ask, how would these rather niche questions inform Nietzsche's philosophical project? And perhaps more importantly, how could the authorship of Homer have any impact on the broader culture? Well, the second question is perhaps easier to answer. For one, at the time in Germany, the influence of Hellenism had been quite profound on the German culture for several decades at this point. I mean, Goethe and Schiller are Hellenists. It completely changed the German culture to where they were often obsessed with the ancient Greeks. But even beyond the Germans and that certain moment in history when Nietzsche gives his lecture, I think we can say that arguably the Iliad and the Odyssey are the foundational texts of the entire Western canon. If we are to construe the West, quote-unquote, as a single civilizational project, when does that project begin? Some might say with the Holy Roman Empire, but could we conceive of the Holy Roman Empire without Christianity? Well, where does Christianity begin? Well, that begins in the Old Roman Empire. Christianity comes out of that time period, that social context. But can we really conceive of the Roman Empire without ancient Greece? Rome is a sister culture to Greece in many important ways. Rome adopts much of Greece's culture as its own after conquering the Greeks. And can we conceive of ancient Greece without Homer? The Iliad and the Odyssey date from the 7th or 8th century BC, and the entire Greek culture, as it comes to us in any recorded form, is indebted to these works. These contain the cultural lexicon of symbols, allegories. They represent the coming into being of the Greek language as literary. That is to say, the transition from oral tradition to the written word, we see that play out in the work of Homer. Basically, every Greek poet, philosopher, tragedian, whoever they are, makes reference to the works of Homer. The fact that every religious reformer, every philosophical radical in the Greek world attacks Homer a few centuries later, that shows just how ubiquitous Homer was, that the Homeric is in some sense inseparable from the Greek culture. And in Homer, arguably, therefore, we find the birth of Greece, and therefore the birth of the West. You can trace it all the way back there, as a literary culture in any sense, the literary birth of the West. What would it mean then if Homer as a person never existed? If Homer is a composite figure, not really an artistic genius at the birth of the Greek world, but a pseudonym for a bunch of poets, or for the pre-existing oral tradition itself, does all of that affect the way we engage with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey? We might think of the words of Goethe, who in his conversations with Eckermann once criticized the historical critics, whom he said, quote, "by a pitiful truth, deprive us of something great," end quote. And to explain what Goethe is getting at here, I could put the problem this way. The meaning of the term classical, etymologically speaking, refers to a work which is of the highest rank. It obviously shares its etymology with class or classic, as in a model or a type. We might say, in creative translation, an archetype. So that which is classical is a model for emulation. It's a type of the first rank. So when the discipline is known as classical philology, what this implies is that we're studying the language, the literature, the poems, the linguistic productions of a culture which are themselves models of the first rank, which provide us, those who study those models, with something to emulate in the way that any artist emulates the master while he's learning his craft. Imitation's often dismissed today as that means second-rate art, but at the very least you have to acknowledge that you learn art by imitation, and you have to do a fair bit of imitating before you can even learn the language of artistic creation. And after you learn that language, then you can improvise. But the Greeks certainly saw art as an activity that was studied by imitating the techniques of the masters. And technique is a word with an ancient Greek root, techne, art or craft. And so this is the perspective that Nietzsche comes up in the German academy. So we're studying Greece, the field of classical philology, because they have these great artistic geniuses whose work we might emulate. And yet, what would it mean if there was no great artistic genius behind the work of Homer? Might this be true in the strict, rigorous, technical sense, but as Goethe would say, a pitiful truth? Another one of Goethe's sayings, which Nietzsche quotes in his essay on the use and abuse of history for life, is, quote, "I hate everything that merely instructs me without increasing or directly quickening my activity," end quote. So if the point of studying the classics is to learn to write or to create in a manner that rivals the classics, that we should therefore only value our study of the ancient world up to the point that it facilitates that end. We should study, in other words, with that end in mind. And Nietzsche famously, in the essay on the use and abuse of history for life, says that there are three potential uses for history, but each of these could easily become abuses if carried out as if it were the sole meaning of history, or carried out in an improper context, or without paying attention to what one's view of history will do to our ability to emulate the classics, for example. So there's a critical way of doing history, which is putting the question to our existing narratives, destroying a historical narrative, deconstructing it, undoing a myth in a way that enlivens us now. Maybe an existing historical narrative has become restrictive or confining, or no longer suits our way of life, the realities of our modus vivendi in the present day. There's also an antiquarian way of doing history, essentially conserving the past, conserving past narratives that have proven useful, especially as regards ways of life. An example of this might be the rustic person who knows the history of his region, lives the same way his ancestors have lived for 10 generations, carries on telling the folk stories that they told when he was a young boy that facilitate the rustic way of life. And finally, there's the monumental way of doing history, which is looking to the past for inspiration, for creativity in the present day. In other words, finding those classic figures and texts, raising a monument to them, so to speak, in that we draw out of those works some ideal or some image of life that can motivate us today in a completely different context. So the monumental use of history would seem to be, at least the stated goal at the outset, of classical philology. It's contained in the name. And yet, this disentangling, this deconstruction of the narrative about Homer would seem to be more of a critical use for history. And so are those two things at odds? Does the critic threaten to give us a pitiful truth in exchange for something monumental? And so we haven't gotten to the actual text of the lecture on Homer yet. These are ideas from a few years after that lecture, in fact. But it's very helpful, again, to see where Nietzsche's thought goes. Again, if we're looking to this lecture as a basis or as a beginning point, because we see a continuity of that same concern, and it appears here in perhaps the earliest form in Nietzsche's thought. And it's related to what he eventually calls the problem of science, in so many words. On the grand scale, science ends up opposing art. Science attempts to bind the world in a rational order, and the best it can do for art is relegate it to the status of entertainment or something of that nature. Contextualize it in a box of the irrational, which may be a basic human need, but nevertheless not the path to the truth, which under the scientific worldview is the most important thing. But this is precisely the problem. In Nietzsche's view, culture is fueled by these irrational sources, whether art or religion, which are brought about by irrational states of mind. The state of rapture in which one is lifted beyond themselves. All artistic creativity seems to come from inspiration, which is prior to any rational intention. Now, on the smaller scale, the problem of science manifests as a series of values or virtues, or we might even say habits, particularly habits of thinking. The scraping and bowing before every trivial fact, as Nietzsche says, the privileging of the objective truth of a statement above the judgment of whether or not that so-called truth furthers life or harms it, whether it makes evaluation and judgment possible. Above all, what we're describing here is a kind of aversion to passion, again, as another sort of thought habit, or in this case, a feeling habit, the desire to be as unmoved as possible while examining the facts. That's the scientific ethos, to be as disinterested as possible. And, of course, as Nietzsche's later philosophy will conclude, thought is interested. It is never an unmotivated, undriven, detached process. Thinking is something that happens from a given perspective, and thinking is in some sense synonymous with or dependent on or a part of willing or of drive. All willing is thinking, all thinking is willing. They can't be disentangled from one another in this way, which means, in some sense, the entire quest to reason dispassionately, to be as unmoved as possible, might be an error in how we think about thinking from the very start. And again, Nietzsche probably had not consciously, thought through all of these ideas yet. Certainly not to the end of where he would think them through in the year 1869. Certainly not. But he's concerned with this same problem in his inaugural address, and this is the form in which it emerges in the text of that speech. Quote, "It must be freely admitted that philology is to some extent borrowed from several other sciences and is mixed together like a magic potion from the most outlandish liquors, ores, and bones. It may even be added that it likewise conceals within itself an artistic element, one which, on aesthetic and ethical grounds, may be called imperatival, an element that acts in opposition to its purely scientific behavior. Philology is composed of history just as much as of natural science or aesthetics. History insofar as it endeavors to comprehend the manifestations of the individualities of peoples in ever-new images, and the prevailing law and the disappearance of phenomena. Natural science, insofar as it strives to fathom the deepest instinct of man, that of speech. Aesthetics, finally, because from various antiquities at our disposal, it endeavors to pick out the so-called classical antiquity, with the view and pretension of excavating the ideal world buried under it, and to hold up to the present the mirror of the classical and everlasting standards, that these wholly different scientific and aesthetico-ethical impulses have been associated under a common name, a kind of sham monarchy, is shown especially by the fact that philology at every period, from its origin onwards, was at the same time pedagogical. From the standpoint of the pedagogue, a choice was offered of those elements which were of the greatest educational value, and thus that science, or at least that scientific aim which we call philology, gradually developed out of the practical calling originated by the exigencies of that science itself." End quote. So let's go over a few things. Philology is a combination of both art and science, and it has an ethical dimension to it. And it has that ethical dimension because it is intended to be pedagogical. Classical philology is supposed to educate us. And this is why he says, so-called classical antiquity in this lecture. And classical is in quotes, because even to call it classical, we're presuming that we can dredge up what Nietzsche calls the ideal world buried in antiquity. And he calls philology a sham monarchy. So all these ends, all these different activities are gathered under a common name, but they're not identical projects. In fact, Nietzsche, with the problem of science, will later come to recognize that these projects are, in some sense at least, antithetical. And that doesn't mean they can't coexist, but they coexist in tension and in hostility. We might say in mutual misunderstanding. So long as culture exists, there's tension between science and art. And that's part of what generates culture. That's part of what culture itself is. That battle between knowledge and perhaps sense or impulse. The mastery of one by the other in various ways. And it's funny, as we'll see by the end of this lecture, Nietzsche is still, in some sense, reverential towards philology. I mean, obviously, he just got his first professorship. He's just been welcomed into the fold, into the club. So there's a touch of irony, a touch of tongue-in-cheek in the way he speaks about the discipline as an outlandish magic potion of a discipline, but he's clearly still reverential towards it, and I think this would all be taken in good humor, but it is funny. I think he's kidding on the square, as they say. He's joking, but in some ways he's actually serious. There's a real critique there. And it should be noted that the discipline of philology was not defined and formalized until Friedrich August Wolff, and he lived from 1759 to 1824. So he dies 20 years before Nietzsche is born. That's how old the discipline is, or rather how young it is, right? So the legend has it that Wolff enrolled in the University of Göttingen, and he submitted his application for the philology department, even though the university had no philology department, but they accepted his application nonetheless. Wolff would then go on to define the discipline of philology with the sanction of Frederick the Great. As Nietzsche wrote in the notes collected in We Philologists, Wolff wrote and taught during a time when there was a fair bit of suspicion towards the Greek culture. He was like on the cusp of Hellenism coming into being, German Hellenism, sort of romantic Hellenism of Goethe and those types. That hadn't really come into being yet. And it was a time when the old Greek texts of antiquity written by pagan authors, Nietzsche says practically had to be smuggled into the university like contraband. Now, Nietzsche's being tongue-in-cheek there as well. I mean, there'd always been the study of Aristotle during the Middle Ages. But the Renaissance represented a huge change, a substantial change in how the ancient texts and ideas were engaged with, and just a huge resurgence of focus on the ancient world. But Nietzsche's narrative of how history played out was that after Luther's Reformation, which was hostile to the Renaissance and the values of pagandom returning to Christianity, Catholicism becomes more militant. They adopted Luther's zeal for coherence and rationalism in their own thought in approaching the texts, and that this sort of preserved the medieval attitude towards the ancient Greeks, that the medieval sensibility treated the Greeks as a foreign culture that was frankly evil. The only way that this could be overcome, therefore, and to promote or foster a study of the Greeks in the wake of Luther and the counter Renaissance that he represented in Nietzsche's view, the only way that this can be overcome was by recasting the Greeks as more humanitarian, and therefore casting the Greeks as the forerunner of Enlightenment civilization, even of Christian civilization itself. And this revision, there are stirrings of it even before the Renaissance. It appears in some way in the work of Dante, but really this, again, there's sort of it's not a clean, neat picture where you just have the Greeks come into, a resurgence of focus on the ancient world come into Europe. There's a pushback against it, a desire to retain the medieval sensibilities towards the pagan world. What changes this after the Renaissance, after the Reformation, and with the dawning of the Enlightenment, what changes this is a number of people, among them Friedrich August Wolff, but even before him, the art historian Winckelmann in Germany. There's a shift in how the ancient Greeks are portrayed. Winckelmann, of course, famously said that the Greeks had a sort of noble simplicity and serene greatness. And, he was spending all his time examining these Greek statues and the way they reflected nature and the artistic mastery of technique involved in them. But he has this romantic vision of the Greeks as an image of placidity or an idyllic society. And Friedrich August Wolff, he said that the Greeks and Romans, they had a continuity of civilization between one another, so that we could understand the Greco-Roman civilization as sort of one thing, and that together they represent the most literary people of the ancient world. And he said that they strived for what he called higher enlightenment, that they surpassed what might be called a mere bourgeois achievement of material wealth, that their greatness is that they established an empire of the mind. Now, Nietzsche eventually takes issue with this, and he writes of this in We Philologists. Again, this is an essay from many years after his inaugural address, but it's where he lays out his entire case of why antiquity is still misunderstood, and it goes all the way back to the beginnings. Quote, "We must find out the forces that stood in the way of increasing our insight into antiquity. First of all, the culture of antiquity is utilized as an incitement toward the acceptance of Christianity. It became, as it were, the premium for conversion, the guilt with which the poisonous pill was coated before being swallowed. Secondly, the help of ancient culture was found to be necessary as a weapon for the intellectual protection of Christianity. Even the Reformation could not dispense with classical studies for this purpose. The Renaissance, on the other hand, now begins with a clearer sense of classical studies, which, however, are likewise looked upon from an anti-Christian standpoint. The Renaissance shows an awakening of honesty in the South, like the Reformation in the North. They could not but clash, for a sincere leaning toward antiquity renders one unchristian. On the whole, however, the Church succeeded in turning classical studies in a harmless direction. The philologist was invented, representing a type of learned man who was at the same time a priest or something similar. Even in the period of the Reformation, people succeeded in emasculating scholarship. It is on this account that Friedrich August Wolff is noteworthy. He freed his profession from the bonds of theology. This action of his, however, was not fully understood, for an aggressive act of elements, such as was manifested by the poet-philologists of the Renaissance, was not developed. The freedom obtained benefited science, but not man." End quote. I love this passage, and it's really from the Apocrypha of Nietzsche. Really, it's something that we don't talk about much in his canon. But so the philologist wishes to have the right to educate the youth, to instruct the young minds in the ways of culture. They're trying to establish themselves as a kind of modern academic priest of culture, so to speak. They know the first-rate model for how we should act, how we should create, and so on. That's their claim. But to have this power, the philologists have to convince the public of the usefulness of philology. And so they're incentivized to speak of their task in terms which are amenable to Christian civilization and the culture of enlightenment. And so the Greeks become a forerunner to enlightenment and to Christendom in the philological world. And so Wolff salvages the Greeks from being the evil pagans that theology told us they were, which allows us then to study them. But this benefits science and not man. Why? Because he falsifies the Greeks in order to get us to consider them worthy of study, to consider the philologist as the one who should enculturate the youth and be the pedagogue. And so the Greeks become a culture of higher enlightenment of the mind, a literary culture. And Nietzsche later will deny this, by the way. He says the Egyptians were far more literary than the Greeks, for example. And that maybe the younger Greeks, the later Greeks, were a culture of the mind, but the earlier Greeks were not, and that there are actually important differences between the Greeks and Romans. Treating them as one Greco-Roman civilization doesn't make as much sense to Nietzsche as it would to Wolff. But Wolff was part of a zeitgeist. I mean, he, along with Winckelmann, they recognized or they perceived the poetic and the artistic value of the Greek culture and their civilization. And so they perhaps fooled themselves, or maybe they consciously exaggerated about the humaneness of the Greeks in order to sell the Greeks to a Christian society. And this, by the way, is why Nietzsche often attacks phrases such as humaneness in his early work, in Birth of Tragedy and in The Greek State, where he attacks phrases such as Greek cheerfulness. And that would be Winckelmann's idea of the Greeks as peaceful, naive, idyllic children of an Arcadian Eden. And, again, that's that noble simplicity and calm and grandeur. You can find Nietzsche directly repudiate those phrases in Birth of Tragedy. So, in any case, why is all of this relevant? Well, Wolff was the one who, in the modern world, raised the issue of Homer's authorship. And this was controversial at the time. Many vehemently disagreed, but Wolff argued that the Iliad and the Odyssey were not composed by one person, but by an oral tradition, and that this tradition sort of stitched together the work over a long period, and that this was a popular composition, that the Odyssey is popular poetry. It's a collective effort. It's something that's repeated by many people, none of them particularly genius, at least not to our knowledge. It's sort of like a folk standard, a folk song, right? That the storytellers who traveled from city to city where people would gather to hear the stories of Homer, they were all recounting perhaps the same canon of tales, but having to recreate the story anew every time they performed it. I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey are, in fact, so long that it seems almost impossible that a single person could have memorized every last line and repeated every last line exactly. So the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey, in Wolff's perspective, is something carried out by the artistic genius of a whole people, we might say, rather than one individual poetic genius who's literally named Homer. Now, does this revelation threaten philology's ability to facilitate our creativity, to quicken our artistic activity, as Goethe would have put it? And in fact, as Nietzsche mentions in his address, Goethe was an early adherent of Wolff's theories regarding Homer, but later in life raised an objection. Nietzsche says in his lecture, quote, "From the circles upon whose help we must place the most implicit reliance, the artistic friends of antiquity, the warm supporters of Hellenic beauty and noble simplicity, we hear harsh voices crying out that it is precisely the philologists themselves who are the real opponents and destroyers of the ideals of antiquity. Schiller upbraided the philologists with having scattered Homer's laurel crown to the winds, and it was none other than Goethe who, in early life a supporter of Wolff's theories regarding Homer, recanted in the verses. End quote. And then he quotes Goethe here, quote, "With subtle wit you took away our former adoration. The Iliad, you may us say, was mere conglomeration. Think it not crime in any way. Youth's fervent adoration leads us to know the verity and feel the poet's unity." End quote. So, to interpret Goethe's poem in the most straightforward way, youth's fervent adoration, so the adoration that we feel in youth, the awe of the grandeur of Homer's epic poems, that is what proves the verity, the truth of the poet's unity. That one person composed the Iliad. We perceive this in the fact that it inspires us. That is, in fact, the justification for saying that Homer exists and he wrote the Iliad. And your subtle wit took that away by calling it a mere conglomeration. So, from the very beginning of philology as a discipline, with the case of Wolff, you have this claim that philology will be educating, that it will enculturate us, that it will provide us with an ideal that we can dredge up from the ancient world. And yet at the same time, the whole reason for that sort of justification for the discipline is to open up the possibility of exploring antiquity scientifically, which leads to this sort of critical view of history, the critical view of things like the authorship of Homer, that are actually at odds with that justification for the existence of the discipline. So there's this contradiction in philology that Nietzsche points to at the beginning of his lecture that has been there from the very beginning. And so it's very interesting that Nietzsche says we ought to look to the artistic friends of antiquity, the warm supporters of Hellenic beauty and noble simplicity. And notice Nietzsche uses that language that he would later rebuke, not 3 years from now, as being an inadequate, erroneous reading of the Greek culture. But the figures that he's pointing to are Goethe and Schiller. And so Goethe and Schiller, as we mentioned, are both Hellenists. Hellenism's a big deal in Germany in the early 1800s, largely due to them, as well as Winckelmann and Wolff. And personally, I would say Goethe and Schiller are every bit as responsible for that Hellenistic zeitgeist as Winckelmann in the realm of art history and Wolff in the realm of beginning philology as a discipline. And Nietzsche makes some very interesting comments about Goethe throughout his career and Goethe's understanding of the Greeks. And I think the most informative comment that he makes is that Goethe didn't even know as much about the Greeks as most philologists do, but he did use the Greeks as an ideal in a way that aided in his artistic creation. So Faust, particularly Faust II, has this theme of Hellenism coming into the modern day, both in the sense that Faust travels back in time to ancient Greece. He brings with him the homunculus, an attempt at creating a human being artificially, who, to vastly oversimplify, allegorically speaking, the homunculus is sort of judged or condemned by the mythic world of the Greeks. It's very revealing about Goethe's ranking of art over science, we might say. And then also in the sense that Helen of Troy, comes into the modern period. Here I mean modern in the sense of early modern period, the time of Dr. Faustus, and at first speaks in these unrhyming hexameter verses, the meter of Greek poetry, but steadily adopts the rhyming verses of contemporary German poetry. So Goethe literally resurrects Helen of Troy in modern times and has her speak in modern language. And so the philologists, as a discipline, claim that the way to instruct young minds, to enculturate them, is to educate them in the classics. We have the knowledge of the classics, so it's us. We are the ones who will make you cultured. But in his essay, We Philologists, Nietzsche asks, what is classical about them? Shouldn't we expect to find, then, among the ranks of classicists, a wealth of great artists? Shouldn't we expect to find people who, by studying the Greeks, have become more masterful, more creative? But we don't find this. Among Germans who studied the Greeks and turned that into something artistically productive, the rare exception among them is Goethe, and he isn't a philologist. And so even though, again, that's how I would think about Nietzsche invoking noble simplicity in this passage, Goethe very much subscribed to that view of the Greeks. I mean, his portrayal of where Helen and Faust get married in the ancient world, they're in sort of an Arcadian Eden, which is very much influenced by Winckelmann. But the point isn't so much whether or not Goethe actually understood the Greeks accurately or whether he used them for something new, because even though Hellenism and the infusion of Hellenism into the world, the modern world, is a big part of Faust Part 2, overall, the story of Faust, the message of Faust, the ideal that Goethe is, the ideals that he's struggling through in that work go well beyond the mere return to Greek ideals or something like that. In fact, as Nietzsche points out, the entire archetype of Faust is only really possible at the end of modernity, at the end of the theoretical way of life, which Goethe is sort of divining the limits of with his character Faust. And there's very much a connection to Christianity. You can't understand the Faust story outside of Christianity either. And so it is very much a modern story. It's very much bears resemblance to a modern novel. So Goethe takes the inspiration, he takes that fire from the ancient Greeks, even if he doesn't fully understand it. Even if Nietzsche will say it was based on many falsehoods, but he actually turns it into something. He actually produces a great work. He actually uses the Greeks as classics in that way. The works, the tragedies of the Greeks become the classical model of emulation for him. They don't just, he doesn't just take from them wholesale. It becomes the creative spark of something new. That's the real valuable way to use the Greeks that Nietzsche is hinting at, gesturing towards in this lecture. And again, it comes from outside of a scientific approach to what the Greek culture represents. But of course, I say Nietzsche gestures toward this because he doesn't explicitly articulate the questions in this way. In this lecture, he poses himself as a defender of philology and raises many of these criticisms as though he is defending philology from these naysayers from outside. So, it's not as if the philologists themselves would have had any antipathy towards Goethe. They probably all loved Goethe as much as anyone else, but Nietzsche's pointing out how people will draw upon the ideas of the artistic lovers of Hellenism who have criticized the philologists for taking away the myth of Homer. Quite frankly, it is a myth that Homer himself as one author was a myth. And perhaps he was a monumental myth which could have inspired us. And Nietzsche says he's bringing up these objections because he doesn't want to be like the sophist who went to Sparta and began defending Heracles. Because you would think the Spartans would love Heracles. So that's bound to be a popular topic among the Spartans, right? A defense of Heracles. But only for the Spartans to say, why are you defending Heracles? Why does he need defending? Who is attacking him? And perhaps more importantly, why would the defender be you? So Nietzsche, in other words, does a very common rhetorical tactic he raises a certain narrative, the narrative of philology, as taking away our mythic ideal, and he makes his speech actually a rejection of that narrative and a defense of philology. But it's funny that Nietzsche himself will raise these same objections throughout his later career. And here I even mean in his philological career. He raises these objections even before he departs the discipline and becomes a philosopher. So in that way, I think we can take his rhetorical technique of bringing these criticisms to the forefront, either as perhaps these very criticisms were gestating within Nietzsche himself, so he's answering himself, or perhaps he's even consciously, sneakily trying to criticize the discipline while presenting himself as its defender. And so here, Nietzsche says the real task of philology is bridging the gulf between ideal antiquity and real antiquity. And he says the great steps forward in philology always lead us closer to the ideal antiquity rather than away from it. And of course, Nietzsche would later explicitly argue the opposite. And again, much of that is in the essay We Philologists. But here, he presents it as his mission statement. Quote, "Let us talk as we will about the unattainability of this goal, and even designate the goal itself as an illogical pretension. The aspiration for it is very real, and I should like to try to make it clear by an example that the most significant steps of classical philology never lead away from the ideal antiquity, but to it, and that just when people are speaking unwarrantably of the overthrow of sacred shrines, new and more worthy altars are being erected. Let us then examine the so-called Homeric question from this standpoint, a question the most important problem of which Schiller called a scholastic barbarism, end quote. So the interesting thing in this lecture is that Nietzsche says explicitly, I think there's something in all of you who love antiquity so much that you spend your lives studying it, that we all kind of wish for the attainment of the ideal antiquity, here meaning antiquity as an ideal. Again, antiquity as classical, discovering the way in which antiquity can lead us through our emulation of it to become perhaps artists of the first rank or even people of the first rank. And that's antithetical to a purely scientific understanding of the discipline. From a purely scientific understanding, that desire for an ideal antiquity is somewhat illogical, right? You're conforming your facts to the ideal and not to the real antiquity. If you do that, you're not doing philology as a science, but something more like, well, again, like as a religion, as the priests indoctrinating the youth into the culture. So again, there's that fundamental problem expressed as an undercurrent here that I wonder if the philology department, as he addressed them, actually understood or comprehended that contradiction that Nietzsche is bringing out, that the entire utility of philology as a discipline is sold in terms of its pedagogical value, that it educates us, that there's always a prescriptive element in making a claim about what our education should or ought to be. There's therefore an ethical element. And going all the way back to Plato and antiquity, and carried through in the work of Rousseau and the Enlightenment, there's this notion that education is of critical importance in shaping people of virtue. But you therefore have to be very careful with this question of who has the right to dictate what education shall be. And that's a central moral question for culture. And philology tried to step into this role. But its pedagogical value seems opposed to its scientific operation. And that when philology becomes a pure science, just as when history becomes a pure science, subjected to criticism, to the subtle wit of the scholar, as Goethe put it, all ideals disappear. All ideal figures and events become conglomerations. They become unsubstantiated accounts. They become facts and dates, and we look at, millions of factors and trivial facts. Great people become the figurehead of a confluence of historical forces, and this ceases to inspire us. And therefore, the more artistic use of the Greeks, that of Goethe, in terms of what it does, is actually superior. Whereas the scientific view of the Greeks, begun by Wolff, produces mere philologists, men who don't emulate the Greeks in any way. They can't teach us about them because they don't know them. So the discipline is at odds with itself. And so Nietzsche's touching a fault line here. And yet his tone in doing this, it's almost shockingly neutral. I mean, it's not shocking given the context and given the academic scruples that he was held to and that he held himself to, in which you have to be able to examine these issues neutrally. But it's shocking insofar as Nietzsche says that the dissolution of a concrete historical personality, Homer, he says in this lecture that it's a kind of experiment, the first of its kind in the history of philology as a science, and that we cannot say whether it was successful or not. And that's a shocking claim. That it leaves open the question of whether the discipline of philology is worth anything. And that's why I say I wonder to what degree Nietzsche was even understood by his peers in what he's implying here. But Nietzsche puts it this way, quote, "In Homer, the modern world, I will not say has learnt, but has examined a great historical point of view, and even without now putting forward my own opinion as to whether this examination has been or can be happily carried out, it was at all events the first example of the application of that productive point of view. By it, scholars learnt to recognize condensed beliefs in the apparently firm, immobile figures of the life of ancient peoples. By it, they for the first time perceived the wonderful capability of the soul of a people to represent the conditions of its morals and beliefs in the form of a personality." When historical criticism has confidently seized upon this method of evaporating apparently concrete personalities, it is permissible to point to the first experiment as an important event in the history of science, without considering whether it was successful in this instance or not." End quote. So there's a complication here that Nietzsche, naturally as he is defending philology in this lecture, raises a counter to Goethe or Schiller, and that philology revealed something to us other than the simple fact that Homer wasn't just a single personality. It revealed that a collective can represent its morals and beliefs in the form of a personality. And it's not for nothing that Nietzsche compares himself to the sophist defending Heracles then, because I think this is analogous, because Heracles is another composite character, essentially the monster-slaying hero of many Greek lands, amalgamated into a single figure, into the archetype of a demigod who slays the terrible monsters, and therefore makes the land habitable for mankind. And the early Greek myths are full of stories like this. So you could say that the truth that Heracles is a composite could dissolve your faith in the great man or something like that, or it could reveal to you that the ideal of a great man is necessitated by human beings. Like, it could reveal that even in the operation of the popular zeitgeist, we require that the content of the zeitgeist be poured into a vessel, into a personality. It reveals a need, an impulse to monumentalize, which in a way speaks in favor of monumental history, paradoxically enough. It says that in practice, we need these monuments, that we will even create them where none exists, or where we have a series of ideas or cultural values or something like that. And in order to emulate them, to get inspiration, we have to put them into a concrete form. So we create these mythic stories of heroes, and over time they conglomerate into this one idea. And on the other hand, Nietzsche, at least by implication, gives us some idea of the danger of philology as pure science, and where that can lead, which is to be found precisely in the tendency to explain genius by understanding the details of the artist's background, his upbringing, the conditions of his life. These are all things that we might say are part of the monumental history, but Nietzsche says actually this method, when construed in this way, this mechanism will always be insufficient, that a pure study of biography doesn't constellate into an understanding of the personality of the poet, insofar as what we're really talking about is his personality as it comes through in his style. So what we're calling Homer, the unity of the poet Homer, is really a unity of style that comes out in his work. And knowing more about the biography of Homer wouldn't be the path to understanding that unity of style better. Nietzsche says, quote, "People have attempted to grasp and formulate the individualities of the poets. A certain mechanism forms part of the method. It must be explained, i.e., it must be deduced from principles why this or that individuality appears in this way and not in that. People now study biographical details, environment, acquaintances, contemporary events, and believe that by mixing all these ingredients together, they will be able to manufacture the wished-for individuality. But they forget that the punctum saliens, the indefinable individual characteristics, can never be obtained from a compound of this nature. The less there is known about the life and times of the poet, the less applicable is this mechanism." End quote. So the problem isn't that Wolf shook us of the Homer myth. The myth of Homer as one grand poetic personality, right? If anything, the problem is the claim that to understand the poem, both its meaning, its significance to the Greeks, as well as its significance to us, that we have to scientifically, empirically uncover the details of the author's biography. That's one conclusion that you could actually draw from Wolf's work, that we should be critical, but on the level of biography, on the level of factual details and events and conditions of the person's life. For Nietzsche, Homer, quote unquote, the real Homer that we're talking about is found in the style, again, in what Goethe called a unity of style. And that's why Goethe demanded one Homer, one biographical Homer, even though Wolf demonstrated that one didn't exist. The Homeric for Nietzsche is in the work itself. It's the personality is revealed in the work. And if this isn't the personality of one person, then we have to ask, what kind of personality is it? Nietzsche will say that in antiquity, as in today, what we call the Homeric is not a historical judgment. It's an aesthetic judgment. What we say essentially belongs to the style of Homer, that unity of style. What we say belongs to that are all the great passages in Homer, the verses we still quote today. Verses like, quote, life and death are balanced, as it were, on the edge of a razor, end quote. That comes from the Iliad, or the words of Achilles in the Underworld that I've often quoted on this show, quote, I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt-poor tenant farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead, end quote. So Nietzsche's argument is that every line we find breathtaking in Homer, that becomes an argument for this unity of style. And we let all the dull passages fade into the background. We blame those in the oral tradition. And, that's very funny in and of itself that Nietzsche takes it for granted. There are great passages in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there are dull, ordinary, repetitive, or just uninteresting stretches of the work, right? So, anyway, this has all happened. These assessments have happened in the wake of assuming that the Iliad and the Odyssey are a collaborative effort. And Nietzsche discusses that, in fact, there have always been multiple schools of thought on this issue. But regardless of what position scholars take as regards their assessment of the objective fact of the matter, what they regard as essentially Homeric, what we're pointing to, is based on their aesthetic judgment. It's based on their judgment of the classical nature of the verses before them. Nietzsche argues, quote, everything dull and below the ordinary standard which scholars think that they perceive in the Homeric poems were attributed to tradition, which thus became the scapegoat. What was left of Homer's own individual work? Nothing but a series of beautiful and prominent passages chosen in accordance with subjective taste. The sum total of aesthetic singularity, which every individual scholar perceived with his own artistic gifts, he now called Homer. This is the central point of the Homeric errors. The name of Homer, from the very beginning, has no connection either with the conception of aesthetic perfection or yet with the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer, as the composer of the Iliad and the Odyssey, is not a historical tradition, but an aesthetic judgment. End quote. And again, a really important aspect of this argument is that for Nietzsche, this has always been true. Or from his perspective, it's always been true that, again, as I mentioned, it was even true in the ancient world, that what Woolf actually did was refer back to the ancients themselves, who had already raised the question of Homer's authorship during the Alexandrian period of ancient Greece. It's actually a very old bit of critical history. So this hypothesis of Homer's non-identity, as one person anyway, is from the ancient world. So, it's not a product of modern secular Enlightenment ideology or anything of that nature. Nietzsche says, quote, Friedrich August Wolff has exactly indicated the spot where Greek antiquity dropped the question. The zenith of the historico-literary studies of the Greeks, and hence also of their point of greatest importance, the Homeric question, was reached in the age of Alexandrian grammarians. Up to this time, the Homeric question had run through the long chain of a uniform process of development, of which the standpoint of those grammarians seemed to be the last link, the last indeed which was attainable by antiquity. They conceived the Iliad and the Odyssey as the creations of one single Homer. They declared it to be psychologically possible for two such different works to have sprung from the brain of one genius, in contradiction to the Coryzontes, who represented the extreme limit of the skepticism of a few detached individuals of antiquity, rather than antiquity itself considered as a whole, to explain the different general impression of the two books on the assumption that one poet composed them both. Scholars sought assistance by referring to the seasons of the poet's life and compared the poet of the Odyssey to the setting sun. The eyes of those critics were tirelessly on the lookout for discrepancies in the language and thoughts of the two poems, but at this time also a history of the Homeric poem and its tradition was prepared, according to which these discrepancies were not due to Homer, but to those who committed his words to writing and those who sang them. It was believed that Homer's poem was passed from one generation to another, viva voce. The faults were attributed to the improvising and at times forgetful bards. At a certain given date, about the time of Pisistratus, the poems which had been repeated orally were said to have been collected in manuscript form, but the scribes, it is added, allowed themselves to take some liberties with the text by transposing some lines and adding extraneous matter here and there. This entire hypothesis is the most important in the domain of literary studies that antiquity has exhibited, and the acknowledgement of the dissemination of the Homeric poems by word of mouth, as opposed to the habits of a book-learned age, shows in particular a depth of ancient sagacity worthy of our admiration. From those times until the generation that produced Friedrich August Wolff, we must take a jump over a long historical vacuum, but in our own age we find the argument left just as it was at the time when the power of controversy departed from antiquity. And it is a matter of indifference to us that Wolff accepted a certain tradition that antiquity itself had set up only as a hypothesis. It may be remarked, as most characteristic of this hypothesis, that in the strictest sense, the personality of Homer is treated seriously, that a certain standard of inner harmony is everywhere presupposed in the manifestations of the personality, and that with these two excellent auxiliary hypotheses, whatever is seen to be below this standard and opposed to this inner harmony is at once swept aside as un-Homeric." End quote. So notice what Nietzsche says. There was a school of thought that was very skeptical, that did not represent antiquity as a whole, who thought that the Iliad and the Odyssey could be composed by multiple authors. But the prevailing school of thought does suppose one Homer. But then Nietzsche walks us through how, within that one Homer hypothesis, they still have to account for, okay, well, there was all this oral tradition in which the words of the original genius Homer are altered as they're passed down. And then the scribes, during the time of Pisistratus, which we'll talk about in a moment, when they formalize and collect these works together, took their own liberties. And so even then, we're assuming that multiple authors are involved, even if there was one original author. And the means by which we're distinguishing are, as Nietzsche points out from the very beginning, that aesthetic judgment about the unity of style, that we're presupposing the manifestation of a personality in the text based on not a scientific knowledge that this happened of one author, not an empirical knowledge, but based on an aesthetic judgment, an aesthetic perception. So we have to reach back farther than that period to know what the Hellenes in their classical age thought of the authorship of Homer. If we go back before the Alexandrian period, where these debates had already begun, and that the injection of nuance to the question had already begun. And this leads us back to Pisistratus, who was the tyrant of Athens in the 6th century. And under his reign, the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were standardized. And that's the moment of transition from oral tradition to written word. It can be sourced to Pisistratus. And with everything in history, this process happened in fits and starts. And in many places, it would have happened in different measures or more strongly. It doesn't happen everywhere all at once, right? This transition to becoming a literary, a written word-based society, at least as far as that's how you hand down your cultural artifacts. But in this case, we can actually locate the shift from oral to written language insofar as the Pisistratian recension is a date when the works of Homer are canonically structured in written form. You can say everything. It must have been a long process leading up to that, but we at least have this date to say it. This is at least when that recension happened. And Nietzsche says, again, the scribes took their liberties. Maybe they added or removed verses according to their taste. And this has been acknowledged ever since the ancient days, when ancient scholars studied Homer. And, regarding the oral tradition and the changes that could happen there, we have this tradition of the Homeridae, those who claimed to be descended from Homer, who traveled Greece telling the Homeric epics, or really they were singing them. Ancient Greek had a very sing-songy quality to it, or at least some people think so. And certainly the epic poems were meant to be sung. And the Homeridae would charge money for this. People paid to see it. This tradition goes way, way back. It obviously predates the written record. And again, we have to, or we can only imagine how much improvisation occurred, not to mention innovation, or perhaps even conscious censure or deletion or conscious additions of whatever was the work of the original historical Homer that would have happened just naturally over the course of time. and what would survive and what wouldn't. How does somebody like Pisistratus decide what's authentically Homeric? And I'm reminded here of Jefferson and his Bible. It's not really a Bible, it's his gospel. It's several translations of the gospel in several different languages that Jefferson assembled, that he literally cut and pasted together to create a version of the Gospels with a Jesus who is a consistent Enlightenment humanist. And importantly, Jefferson doesn't just cut out the miracles or the supernatural. People often in American history, when they bring up this sort of trivial fact about Jefferson, or it's not trivial, but when they bring it up as though it were simply trivia, they'll say, Jefferson wrote a Bible where he cut out all the miracles and supernatural stuff, and it's just the moral teachings. No, that's actually not true. Jefferson actually said that some of Jesus's teachings recorded in the Bible are falsified. Some are authentic, some are falsified. Some are later inclusions by lesser men of lesser morals and virtue than the greatest moralist of all time, Jesus Christ. And you might wonder, well, how does Jefferson decide that? By what standard? How does he decide what's the word of Jesus versus a later interpolation? And Jefferson said, the difference stood out to him like a diamond in a dung heap, that the words of this most morally enlightened of all human beings were so different, so obviously different from all the distortions that others had tried to make, that Jefferson said he could not mistake the two. And that all it really takes is good reason, a good conscience, a good sense. You should be able to figure out what is the authentic Jesus and what is the inauthentic. It's only a matter of time until someone does this as the humanist Bible. I'm going to do it. I'm going to cut and paste the Bible from multiple translations and tell you what Jesus' teachings really are according to my own discernment. And so to go back to Pisistratus, and Nietzsche says he'd like for us to imagine ourselves in those days, we were engaged in this same business of determining the authentic Homer from the inauthentic. I mean, for Jefferson, with Jesus, the standard is the morality of the words. For us philologists, or for Pisistratus trying to standardize the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's an aesthetic judgment. And this is likely going on all the time, where the scribes are deciding what is authentically Homer and what isn't according to that kind of judgment. The viewpoint that emerges from this is that Homer is a kind of work of collective genius, we might say. And therefore Nietzsche raises the question, how is it that nature distributes all of its qualities so unevenly, and yet would distribute genius to the whole populace as a kind of emergent property of the whole people? Because in practice it seems as though genius manifests in an individual mind, or that minds have these unequal capacities, and that's at least what's perceptible, that there's one man named Goethe who wrote Faust, there's one crazily inventive guy named Tesla who invents or discovers alternating current. So how do we deal with this claim? Well, I think there is some sense to the account that you could say Goethe was part of a romantic zeitgeist, and it happened to have been him. But if it wasn't, a different aristocrat with a similar talent would have written similar but different works or something. Or, I mean, it's a bit difficult with the arts, but we might say that the popularity is selecting for a kind of ideal of sorts, and the artist who happens to most closely match that form of the ideal is selected as a representative of the age. Where science and technology is advancing, especially as regards electricity during Tesla's time, and this is the era where the modern electrical grid is essentially created. If Tesla didn't discover alternating current, presumably someone else would have. The fact is that there is this world of electricity waiting to be discovered, whether Tesla specifically exists or not to discover it. So this view has a sense to it, but one has to ask, how do we determine whether a work is the product of an individual poetical genius or the popular poetical genius of the people? Is that even a falsifiable claim, or are we simply navel-gazing? Is this just a post hoc description as accords our own view of history, or could we actually tell the difference? Could we make this a falsifiable claim? And Nietzsche has an interesting response to that. Quote, "This whole contrast is unjust and misleading. There is no more dangerous assumption in modern aesthetics than that of popular poetry and individual poetry, or as it is usually called, artistic poetry. This is the reaction, or if you will, the superstition, which followed upon the most momentous discovery of historico-philological science, the discovery and appreciation of the soul of a people. For this discovery prepared the way for a coming scientific view of history, which was until then, and in many respects is even now, a mere collection of materials, with the prospect that new materials would continue to be added, and that the huge overflowing pile would never be systematically arranged. The people now understood for the first time that the long-felt power of greater individualities and wills was larger than the pitifully small will of an individual man. They now saw that everything truly great in the kingdom of the will could not have its deepest root in the inefficacious and ephemeral individual will. And finally, they now discovered the powerful instincts of the masses and diagnosed those unconscious impulses to be the foundations and supports of the so-called universal history. But the newly lighted flame also cast its shadow, and this shadow was none other than that superstition already referred to, which popular poetry set up in opposition to individual poetry, and thus enlarged the comprehension of the people's soul to that of the people's mind. The masses have never experienced more flattering treatment than in thus having the laurel of genius set upon their empty heads. Now, however, such a contrast between popular poetry and individual poetry does not exist at all. On the contrary, all poetry, and of course popular poetry also, requires an intermediary individuality." End quote. So, at a glance, this is a very different way than the way Nietzsche will later speak of these issues, the interaction between the masses and the individual, or individual art versus the popular art. But there are some things we should... There is a very deep subtlety to this passage that I want to read. And it is very different that Nietzsche almost seems to be mediating between these positions, saying the masses require an intermediary individuality, but the will, the pitiful and ephemeral will of the individual doesn't matter as much as the greater will of the people. And so in Oscar Levy's translation, he makes a footnote where he says that, Nietzsche says this here: the masses now perceive the greater number of individualities and wills as larger than the pitifully small will of the ephemeral individual. Oscar Levy says Nietzsche later realized this was not so. And Levy's translations are rather good, but this shows I don't think he really grasped the structure of Nietzsche's argument here. Because Nietzsche isn't saying that the masses actually do poeticize, that genius actually is possessed popularly or generally. He brings that up as a consequence, another potential consequence of these historical criticisms. The discovery of a power of a people to create poetic genius sets the laurel of genius on the empty heads of the masses. That's what happens when we make everything the result of historical forces, every individual something merely demanded by the greatest majority. We ignore that the mediation of that person's individuality is also a necessary part of the interaction. That, he says, however, the contrast does not exist. There requires an intermediary individuality. It can't just be the popular poetic spirit or what have you. That poetry doesn't just come from the collective unconsciousness or something. It does have to be written by individuals. So Homer is a collaborative project, but it doesn't imply that Homer's written in a democratic fashion with everyone contributing equally to it. It's not a folk tradition in that sense, and even folk traditions don't just come out of the ether. That's just as much of a fanciful view of Homer as the view of Homer as a single person, that the old myth of Homer. That in fact, the reality is that a series of individuals created Homer as the mediating forces between the poetic spirit of the zeitgeist and the final product, which is ultimately judged as, again, from that aesthetic evaluation. So in other words, that's all to say, I don't think Nietzsche is saying that the will of the individuals is ephemeral and pitiful. I don't think he's making that statement as a final analysis. I think he's saying it's very easy to make that leap from the idea that there is this popular poetry or that poetic genius can be distributed among the population, but it's actually more complicated than that. Now, even that mediation, as I pointed out at the beginning, even that kind of thought that attempts to produce a synthesis is probably not, it's not the the tone that Nietzsche will sound later in his philosophy, but it's not quite the way Oscar Levy portrays it either, in my opinion. So Nietzsche isn't saying that the view of history as, simply necessities created by a mass of forces. He isn't saying that that's correct. That a zeitgeist moves art and the culture. He's saying that the reason we believe this comes directly out of the rejection of the mythic authorship of Homer, but ultimately that view isn't correct either. Quote, if we apply all these principles to the Homeric poems, it follows that we gain nothing with our theory of the poeticizing soul of the people, and that we are always referred back to the poetical individual. We are thus confronted with the task of distinguishing that which can have originated only in a single poetical mind from that which is, so to speak, swept up by the tide of oral tradition, and which is a highly important constituent part of the Homeric poems. End quote. And we've already answered how this was done in Nietzsche's viewpoint, his answer as to how. We might come up with how we think it should be done. We might say maybe it should have been done more scientifically, determining the individual elements from the elements of the masses. But we know there's no ultimate scientific way to do that, and that in practice, regardless of how we think it should be done, it has been done as an aesthetic judgment. And so that's all very subversive, because Nietzsche's saying not that we should base our philology on aesthetics, but that you already do. That we pride ourselves on being hard-boiled realists, but really we all have that urge to reach for the ideal of antiquity, as he tried to hint at earlier in the speech. And even though we might critique the historicity of Homer as one person and act as though it makes us so scientific as a discipline, so modern and sophisticated, we're only resurrecting the hypotheses that already existed in the ancient world regarding Homer. And we're doing the same thing that they did, that Pisistratus did when he standardized the texts, where we make these aesthetic judgments about it and leap from those judgments to concrete claims about the authorship. And so Nietzsche writes, or he says in the lecture, quote, the Iliad is not a garland, but a bunch of flowers. As many pictures as possible are crowded on one canvas, but the man who placed them there was indifferent as to whether the grouping of the collected pictures was invariably suitable and rhythmically beautiful. He knew well that no one would ever consider the collection as a whole, but would merely look at the individual parts, but that stringing together of some pieces as the manifestations of a grasp of art which was not yet highly developed, still less thoroughly comprehended and generally esteemed, cannot have been the real Homeric deed, the real Homeric epoch-making event. On the contrary, this design is a later product, far later than Homer's celebrity. The relative imperfection of the design must not, however, prevent us from seeing in the designer a different personality from the real poet. It is not only probable that everything which was created in those times with conscious aesthetic insight was infinitely inferior to the songs that sprang up naturally in the poet's mind and were written down with instinctive power. We can even take a step further. If we include the so-called cyclic poems in this comparison, there remains for the designer of the Iliad and the Odyssey the indisputable merit of having done something relatively great in this conscious technical composing, a merit which we might have been prepared to recognize from the beginning, and which is, in my opinion, of the very first order in the domain of instinctive creation. We may even be ready to pronounce this synthesization of great importance. We believe in a great poet, as the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but not that Homer was this poet. The decision on this point has already been given. The generation that invented those numerous Homeric fables, that poeticized the myth of the contest between Homer and Hesiod, and looked upon all of the poems of the epic cycle as Homeric, did not feel an aesthetic but a material singularity when it pronounced the name Homer. This period regards Homer as belonging to the ranks of artists like Orpheus, Eumolpus, Daedalus, and Olympus, the mythical discoverers of a new branch of art, to whom therefore all the later fruits which grew from the new branch were thankfully dedicated. End quote. So why is it significant that Nietzsche denies that Homer is the author, only to return to this seemingly individual view of the great poet view of the authorship of Homer? Why does he say there was a great poet behind the work, just not named Homer? Well, obviously, logically, he couldn't be named Homer because Homer was a famous name. Homer was a celebrity that would already have been known by the time this great artist came and performed this act of synthesis. And again, you could ask, is there literally only one genius, one poetic synthesizer? Maybe there was a string of mediocre geniuses who all contributed. For Nietzsche, I don't think that matters as much. At least he presents these theories relatively neutrally here. The important thing for him is that individual poetic genius was involved, that there is no popular poetry without the individual genius, and vice versa. These two things are related and presuppose one another, and it's almost like a pathology to try and deny one or the other aspects in determining how it is that something like the Odyssey or the Iliad shapes a culture. And so in the same way that the theogonies, they say they were originally handed down by Orpheus. Every religious innovation ends up getting tied back to Orpheus eventually. It's because he's a mythic character. He's the mythic imparter of the wisdom of gods to men. Similarly, Homer is the mythic storyteller, and this name existed. This whole category of poetry said to have come from Homer existed. And after this, when the Greek society is a concept of the Homeric, then one or some number of individual geniuses presented the best possible form of the Homeric stories, the ideal of what Homer could be. And so this genius or group of geniuses, they were more designers than spontaneous poets. They were synthesizers rather than creators. But even this rank ordering of what is aesthetically valuable in the highest order, this judgment of which is mundane or dull, but still needs to remain in the story as part of the tradition, all of that is an act of creation too. That also requires inspiration. So the beautiful line that Nietzsche gives us, that the Iliad is not a garland, it's a bunch of flowers. It's undoubtedly stitched together. The creative genius is in the stitching. And the Odyssey and the Iliad were not conjured from just out of the ether, from the poetic zeitgeist, from the Rousseauian general will. These are magical views of culture, again, just as ignorant as the naive myth that there was a single Homer. So Nietzsche argues, quote, those great conceptions, such for example as that of the indivisible and inviolable poetic genius Homer, were during the pre-Wolffian period only too great, and hence inwardly altogether empty and elusive when we now try to grasp them, end quote. And so, to summarize, Nietzsche's argument is essentially that Homer's non-existence as a single personality is not an argument against poetic genius. It complicates the picture, but it shouldn't lead us to this view of the oral tradition as coming from no one. In fact, there's always individual genius involved, and what's more important for Nietzsche is that we have identified the necessity of the ideal of the poetic genius. We've identified the need for the myth of Homer, just as perhaps there was a need for the myth of Heracles among the Greeks, and it reveals to us ultimately, again, that strange chimerical quality of philology that Nietzsche suggested at the beginning, that our ends in philology in uncovering the facticity of these works, the works of classical antiquity, cannot be done dispassionately. They have to be done with a certain end in mind. And if it's pure science, that will be at odds with the pedagogical function of philology. And furthermore, the science seems to reveal that we have, since the beginning, based our philological claims on aesthetic judgments. That seems to be empirically true, that we do that, which can't be justified by science, those judgments. That we could say from the start of the discipline itself, the entire method has been motivated, it's been interested, it's been involved. And so perhaps the most disappointing thing about the end of this address is how Nietzsche simply returns to capitulate to the value of philology, which again has to be only expected given the context. He's not going to launch into, we're not going to see the development of his full-fledged critique of philology here in this work. Obviously, it's something that has to develop later, that we especially see in We Philologists and in Use and Abuse of History for Life. But he says that, in this recapitulation, some have said philology now appears as a heap of ashes, but it can never turn into a fruitful and rich soil for the future. And Levy here correctly points out that Nietzsche would later directly contradict that statement. Nietzsche is unequivocally saying, philology is what makes the old new again, creates new conceptions out of the old world. There's something creative and transformative going on in philology as a discipline. That is his position at the end of this speech, but by the time he wrote We Philologists, he certainly didn't believe that anymore. And here in his lecture, he also lauds philology for having been the science that uncovered the ancient world at all. Again, if it hadn't been for figures such as Wolff, we would not now have so much knowledge of classical antiquity. We might say Whether people are emulating the Greeks today or not, at least we have the texts, we have the translations that make it a possibility. And so in this way, Nietzsche closes out his speech by praising philology and indicating that as a science, it has benefited mankind. And again, he'll later turn about and criticize that view. The worst thing that he says, or I shouldn't put it like that, the line that's most at variance with later Nietzsche's thought and outlook, which is so opposite his later thought, and in such a naive way that it almost upends my entire project of showing the development of Nietzsche's ideas in this lecture, because in no way does this thought lead into anything else. It's just simply, he would later say this was just wrong. But he says, quote, "Philology comes into a world full of gloomy colors and pictures, full of the deepest, most incurable woes, and speaks to men comfortingly of the beautiful and godlike figure of a distant, rosy, and happy fairyland." End quote. And that's the romantic picture of ancient Greece. Greece as idyllic, effectively as a kind of otherworld, right? Not in the form of heaven, but more in the form of a lost golden age, of a Rousseauian paradise. And Nietzsche would completely repudiate that idea. Not only that view of who the Greeks were, which he says they were not like that, or of just using the Greek world as a salve for our modern woes. I mean, at least he's saying the wisdom of the Greeks directly speaks to us today, but we find none of Nietzsche's philosophical sentiments in this. And it's one of his final statements in this lecture, which should remind us that, again, it's the work of a very young man with very different ideas from his later career. But what's of greater interest is how Nietzsche directly ends the speech, at least greater interest to me. Quote, "It is but right that a philologist should describe his end and the means to it in the short formula of a confession of faith, and let this be done in the saying of Seneca, which I thus reverse. Quote, Philosophia facta est quae philologia fuit." End quote. By this, I wish to signify that all philological activities should be enclosed and surrounded by a philosophical view of things, in which everything individual and isolated is evaporated as something detestable, and in which great homogeneous views alone remain. Now, therefore, that I have enunciated my philological creed, I trust you will give me cause to hope that I shall no longer be a stranger among you. Give me the assurance that in working with you towards this end, I am worthily fulfilling the confidence with which the highest authorities of this community have honored me. End quote. So, philosophy, Nietzsche's Latin phrase, is a reversal of Seneca's. Philosophy has become what philology was. And this is fascinating because it indicates what became of philology in the mind of Nietzsche more than anything, what philology was for him, that it eventually becomes philosophy. In a way, he's foreseeing the transformation that's going to occur in his own thought. And so when he says philosophy should enclose his philological work, it should evaporate everything individual and isolated, that's very curious because it's a rejection of philology as pure science. Right? The scientific spirit of groveling before every trivial fact. Instead, it embraces the philosophical tendencies of, frankly, the pre-Socratics, looking for the unity, seeking to name the one, the arche, and Nietzsche wishes to enclose his philological activity within that kind of philosophical unifying impulse. And that's how he chooses to describe his creed, as it were. And again, we can only wonder how his colleagues would have taken all of this. So what is the broader significance to Nietzsche's later work? Well, to understand that, we have to zoom out a bit. Look at the big picture of German culture at the time. And also ask, what is Nietzsche really asking in this lecture from that vantage point? What is his guiding question? He's asking, what is it we're doing in philology? Are we really the educators of the culture? And if so, what is our scorecard? How has that turned out? And as I already mentioned, Germany at this time is just dominated by Hellenism. I mean, I read something called the tyranny of Greece over Germany, referring to this time in German history. The fact that their higher culture is just absolutely inundated in Hellenism, in the Greeks, for decades and decades. And once again, Goethe, the greatest poet of the German language, is a Hellenist. And we have to remember, there's no German state when Nietzsche gives this lecture. There isn't one until 3 years later. The Second German Reich doesn't form until 1872, when Nietzsche writes Birth of Tragedy. Right now, Germany's a people, but it's not a single culture. This does not present itself as being a pressing problem for him here in 1869, before Germany unifies, or at least not to the same degree. But it's precisely that unification that pushes this issue of German culture to the fore, because it becomes clear that politically, Germany is about to become a powerful force. They've just easily defeated France at that time, and that's why Nietzsche wrote, Deutschland über alles. I fear that was the end of German philosophy. Meaning, in politically unifying, we believed that we were done seeking those eternal questions of culture, as if the political unification also unifies the culture or coheres the culture or something. That we're done seeking, period. Perhaps some would believe that in the very act of creating a nation, a culture exists eo ipso. But Nietzsche will later say, no, that isn't the reality. Germany's appropriating all sorts of things to itself, all of these contradictory ideals, contradictory values that are in tension and make no sense together. Now, it isn't the case that a culture can't contain contradictory beliefs, but where that tension cashes out, so to speak, is in the practical effect that the culture has in the lives of its members. So we might say a culture could both value freedom and duty, which are contradictory values in some ways, but perhaps the way of life that the culture demands, navigates this contradiction in some way. That it's not enough to state some cultural ideal in the abstract. That's not culture. That's like science, right? This whole process of abstracting qualities and listing and categorizing them, right? But no, culture is lived. There's actually a concrete instantiation of the ideal, and that the form it takes is very important for establishing that interaction between competing ideals. And so Nietzsche would later write, and this is found in the case of Wagner, that the German nation of his time was, quote, becoming ever lazier and more impoverished in its instincts, gobbling down without any digestive troubles faith as well as scientific manners, Christian love as well as anti-Semitism, the will to the Reich as well as the gospel of the humble, end quote. We might say that under the tyranny of Greece over Germany, Hellenism becomes one more impulse that the Germans are gobbling up. And they attempted to do so, however, in the same country where the Reformation started, right? The whole squandering of the Renaissance, from Nietzsche's perspective, is the fault of Luther. And, in fact, Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, every crime of culture of the last centuries lies on Germany's conscience. And yet, that's where the new Hellenism is born. And now it all begins to make sense, I think. Germany is Hellenist, yes, but their image of Hellenism is that, again, serene tranquility, calm and greatness, or else higher enlightenment, a humane and literary culture. In other words, the Greeks are the forerunners of our own Enlightenment humanist society, which means emulating them would just be emulating ourselves, wouldn't it? So do the Greeks really give us a new standard, a new ideal, a new goal to reach for, or do we simply end up filling them as a vessel of projections? We fill them with ourselves and pat ourselves on the back for carrying on the tradition of the Greeks. And of course, we all know Nietzsche would later challenge all those views. He was especially inspired by Jacob Burckhardt, whom he would meet at Basel that same year. And he would emphasize the lack of individual rights in the Greek polis. He would emphasize the violence at the birth of the Greek polis, the lack of any sense for objective truth. And eventually, Nietzsche would produce his own interpretation of Greece that's a radical inversion of our modern morality, but in a way that's getting ahead of ourselves. What is of significance as regards Nietzsche's lecture on Homer, therefore, is that he raises the issue of whether or not philology is actually giving Germany a culture. And of course, at this point, he presents his case as an apologetic for philology. His conclusion is that philology is doing this, but in just a handful of years, he turns against those views, which means it very rapidly dawned on the young Nietzsche just how deficient the German culture was, because again, culture is lived, and as he says in his essay on the use and abuse of history for life, quote, we moderns have nothing of our own. We only become worth notice by filling ourselves to overflowing with foreign customs, arts, philosophies, religions, and sciences. We are wandering encyclopedias, as an ancient Greek who had strayed into our time would probably call us. But the only value of an encyclopedia lies in the inside, in the contents, not in what is written outside, in the binding or the wrapper. And so the whole of modern culture is essentially internal. The bookbinder prints something like this on the cover: Manual of Internal Culture for External Barbarians, end quote. So what does it mean if our culture isn't externalized? It means that our conception of culture is as knowledge in our heads rather than something that actually is acted out or affects the world or comes through in your behavior or through your body even. The knowledge has to be integrated into your character. So for the inclusion of Greece into Germany to mean anything, for it to not merely be an empty projection or appropriation or an empty adornment, it actually has to change your life, perhaps even down to your daily habits. Nietzsche says in one passage in We Philologists that the German adornment with Greek culture is like a gold paper, because nothing in our world actually resembles the Greek world. And as Burckhardt says, though, we still use the phrases of the Greeks when we speak. We see through their eyes. But that question keeps coming back to haunt Nietzsche. Are our philologists, the scholars who study Greece, really emulators of it? And once he determines that the Greek culture is not serene and cheerful, he realizes just what the problem is, that we've falsified the picture of the Greeks precisely to cover up the Dionysian, that orgiastic madness that lies at the roots of true Hellenism. And in a way, he sees that madness, that irrationality, as at the heart of the Greek culture. It's what drives their tragedy. It's what produces the Greek tragedy. And Greek tragedy is so central to their culture. So this would mean philology is not the proper discipline for enculturating the generations. We can't approach induction into culture through a scientific discipline. Perhaps the last places left where those aesthetic concerns and those pedagogical concerns can actually be a potent driving force in one's life would be philosophy and art. And so that's why he prefigures his transition to philosophy in this speech. And that philosophy might be the thing that's needed to save us from a shallow, empty culture, this false culture that makes these pretenses of ownership to people and events that are so foreign to it, so antithetical to its own values. And so this reveals the tension between science and art yet again, or even between science and philosophy. We might think of Nietzsche's fragment entitled Science and Wisdom in Battle, where science, again, is more empirical, it's more investigating individual disconnected facts, and wisdom is sort of like the constellation of facts, something more the domain of philosophy. And this all points Nietzsche in the direction of, the only way to really put this is reevaluating the values that we have placed on certain things in our modern culture, such as the value of science, or we might say the theoretical way of life. The beginning of the revaluation of values, the questions that eventually lead Nietzsche there, that beginning is present here in this speech, even though I don't think they're consciously there yet. Rather, it's that under this guiding question of what is philology supposed to do, and has it actually done this task, that Nietzsche takes his first philosophical steps. He will eventually conclude that philology has not done what it set out to do. And the reason for this is that our values are wrong. We've evaluated these different strivings of human culture, the human mind, in an incorrect way. And we need to reevaluate those values. That notion begins here. That's all for this week, everyone. Join me next time for Horkheimer and Adorno's book, Dialectic of Enlightenment. Cheers, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.